Thank you very much, Natasha, for your generous words. And also thank you very much to all of you for being here. So you'll hear a lot more about Catalan-Spanish bilingualism today from a slightly different perspective of what I've been doing so far. So let me start with something that might be shocking to you, and please don't quote me on that, but learning a second language is not easy. And we know that non-native accents persist even after many years of experience with the second language, and even if we learn the second language very early in life. And we know also that the accents can be noticed in different aspects of phonetic behavior, say speech production. Obviously, that's the first thing that gives us away, but we also hear with an accent or recognize or don't recognize them with an accent. And we also know that non-native accents are mostly due to interlingual phonetic interactions or phonological interactions of some sort, so that non-native accents are not random. We can speak of Spanish accented English, German accented English, whatever, Russian accented English, so that non-native accents of learners who share a native language differ from native norms in systematic, predictable ways. At some point in the past, researchers were more likely to do research on what was not predictable from native language experience, but most of it is. So in my opinion, it makes more sense that we do research on this first, and then we'll do other things. But that's my opinion. The fact that interlingual phonetic interactions exist, and they are obvious, and we notice them, has been incorporated in all theoretical models on second language speech learning and bilingual phonetics, such as the SLM, PAM-L2, L2LP, ASP. They all have ways of dealing with this. And they all establish that there are links that are formed or established between the native and non-native sounds, and then these links may be modified during learning with experience. And the funny thing about them, and it's not intuitive to a lot of us, is that the second language can also impact the first language, so that these interactions affect the native language too. And these interactions from the second to the first occur quite early in second language learning. It doesn't only happen in early bilinguals, it also happens in adult learners after, say, week 4 or week 5 or being exposed to the second language. There's 2 articles in Journal of Phonetics about this recently, and they were shocking to me, maybe not to you. And we also know this, and you know this well, there's a consequence of hearing with an accent and speaking with an accent and non-native interactions, or native and non-native, is that they lead to difficulties with contrasts, with phonological contrasts. And this is one way of dealing with this from a, say, theoretical point of view, the single category assimilation concept of the PAM-L2 model, in which there is a contrast that is specific to the second language. These 2 sounds of the second language are assimilated or linked to only 1 sound in the native language, and this linking of 2 to 1 makes the acquisition or the command of the second language specific contrast very difficult, because they're both linked to the same. And this, of course, we also have good experience with this. We know that Japanese learners of English have problems or challenges with R and L, and so managing the distinction between rock and lock. And then Spanish speakers like myself, peak, pick. Dutch learners have problems with and German learners have problems with sink, sink. So presumably, although it is not clear that this happens in this way, this challenges in acquiring this contrast or managing this contrast might have consequences for how robust lexical representations are of the words that have these contrasts. And let me give you an example and show you or try to argue why you should care about these things, even if you are a morphologist. You don't hear it. This is supposed to work. Sorry. You've heard this one, right? Shut up. Okay. Yeah, it's good.
Das hier ist ein Mindset-Block. Das hier ist nicht das Gewissensgeflüster, das Überlebens... Ja. Hello? This is the German Coast Guard. What are you thinking about?
You might not care about second language phonetics, but if you're on that boat, you really would. Move to the next one. Okay, so let me give you an example, kind of superficially, of a language contact situation that we've been examining recently. Mostly Joseph Casillas, a student in the Spanish department who is here today, has been doing research on speakers of English, native, legitimate speakers of English, who speak only English, actually, but had experience with Spanish at home while growing up. So their parents speak Spanish. They quite never managed to learn it, or they did in the first few years, and they lost it. So there was this study of 3 groups of participants, 2 control groups on the 2 sides, the English monolinguals on one extreme, the the late learners of English on the other extreme, native language Spanish, and the early learners of English who were native speakers of English who were exposed to Spanish at home because they are of Spanish or Mexican heritage. And there are a lot of tasks looking at production, perception, spoken word recognition, and we'll look at some of the results. And the contrast that we examined that he examined were the meet-met contrast, which is supposed to be a very easy contrast, and the pot-pat, difficult because they both presumably assimilate to one Spanish a, and sheep-ship, also difficult because it assimilates presumably to one Spanish e. First, these are the native speakers of English, the monolingual data, and these are the 2 clouds for a or pot-pat, separate clouds, different categories, not a problem. These are the late learners, more of a problem. And the speakers of English with Spanish heritage, although they do not speak Spanish, do really not have the same kind of contrast that the others do. Notice that the position of these vowels on the vowel space is very much the same for this group. So this is the Arizona or California system, a little quite back, further back. It's not that they are leaving it back because of their Spanish heritage, but the contrast is not managed in the same way, or not controlled in the same way. Now for this other contrast, there's not much of a problem. E, very different for the native English speakers, not so much for the late learners, and the early learners don't differ from the native English. But if you look at the spectrum, it doesn't differ. What happens if you look at duration? And here, there is a difference. So this is the native English group, difference in duration between E. This is the late learners, no difference in duration. And this is the early learners, no difference in duration. So this group, the one that matters here, the early learners are able to use the spectrum in the same way that the native English monolinguals would use it, but they don't use duration in their production. And so one could ask, what happens in their perception? Right? Do they depend more on one of the cues because this is the one that they use in their speech? And one way of testing the cue weighting of the different cues in this perception, the perception of this contrast, is drawing this and creating stimuli on this grid. Duration, 11 steps, and then spectrum, 11 steps. This will be I, this will be E, and you have stimuli all over the place, so that you have here a vowel with the spectrum of I, but the duration of E, and here a vowel with the spectrum of E, but the duration of I. So what would happen in these cases? And this is what happens, and I find this interesting, and this is why I'm showing you research that is not mine, but it's interesting. So there's a wireframe and a heat map of the native English, the control group. Notice that, well, this is spectrum, this is duration, and they are using from 0 to 1 the whole range of possibilities. So this would be 1 or 100% proportion of answering E, and they are getting it here, which would be the prototypical E, and they're not getting it here, which would be the prototypical I. But this and this doesn't differ much, and this don't differ much. So basically, they are basing their perception on spectrum and not so much on duration, although they produce the difference in duration. Now you go to the late learners. They did not produce the difference in duration. They did not produce the difference in spectrum either, and they don't get it in perception. So they go from 3 to 7 and not from 0 to 100, whatever, or 0 to 1. So it's not quite categorical contrast, obviously, but it's not that completely random. They are getting it from somewhere, but they are basing it mostly on duration. Okay? Whatever they are getting is duration-based. And this is the other group. The production of their contrast was quite close of being native or monolingual at least, and it is for the ones that are prototypical E and prototypical I. This is the not prototypical whatever E, based on spectrum mostly, but here, this is interesting when they are getting conflicting cues, the duration of one and the spectrum of the other, they are not basing their perception on duration, but duration is bothering them a little bit. So they're paying attention to duration in a way that native English speakers, monolingual speakers, would not. Okay. That was just an example. And so what we've learned so far is that native language sounds affect subsequent experience. So we can talk about interlingual sound interactions. And to me, what's interesting about this research is that experience at a very early age has a long-term effect. Presumably, we could find that this is the explanation. There might be others. Even overhearing a language might have an effect on the other language, the one that becomes the dominant or only language. And that affects production and perception. But let me tell you what my problems are with this. And not specifically this research, is the models that refer or that try to explain second language phonetics or interlingual interactions. And this is my problem. All of these models posit that interactions are developed at the level of the system. So there are always interactions between phonemes, allophones, something that is devoid of lexical context, so that you could just draw these interactions on an inventory table, whatever, a table of phonemes or table of allophones. That would be enough. You don't need access to anything else, and that's how they are explained. But in my opinion, this assumes a model in which lexicon and inventory resided separately, and the lexicon doesn't matter. And I think that this view of phonology has been criticized in the last few years, and I don't think that second language models have been following through. And I also think that it matters a lot, a recent finding in bilingualism language recognition showing that lexical connections affect interactions. So this piece of research showed that T in Spanish and T in English, which differ, would be closer in their VOT if they are used in cognates. If it's non-cognates, they're further away. So if there are lexical connections, that matters for the similarities of these sounds. That would be one thing. Another thing that we might be missing from those explanations is what has been posited by other researchers, non-phoneticians or non-phonologists. This is a simple view, but it's something that has been overlooked, also in my opinion. So these researchers, Grosjean and Paradis, posit that there's a difference between interactions in representation or competence and interactions in processing or performance. So that interaction or interference in representation is when a feature of one language is incorporated into the competence, the knowledge, the grammar of the bilingual's other language. While interactions in processing is when a feature of one language is inadvertently introduced into the other language during use without affecting long-term knowledge of the other language. It occurs during processing due to simultaneous activation of both languages. It doesn't really change what you know of the other language, it just shows up circumstantially in this moment. So we need to know whether this might have played an effect on what we know on second language phonetics so far. And this is important because, as I was saying, most models don't use the lexicon and don't use processing at all, and use only the inventory and representation. So that phonetic studies in bilingualism usually explore features that are attributed to competence interference or interference in representation. First, they always use, or for the most part, they use bilinguals and compare them to monolingual controls. And that idea of having a monolingual control is a bit of a problem. Of course, you're comparing apples and oranges. You'll find a difference. Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, that's what we expected. And I just showed you some research that uses a monolingual group as a control, so I'm not advocating for not using them at all. I'm advocating for moving a little bit away and doing something else as well, and comparing bilinguals in different situations. And usually the interpretations of this kind of research are that the differences between bilinguals and monolinguals are because bilinguals have some sort of behavioral limitation, or they have entrenched behavior, or that is part of their grammatical knowledge, or something like this. So my question will be, is there a role for processing? And the way that I will be exploring the role for processing is also with a simple model that I'm sure it's a very simple idea, but it's still useful. It's the bilingual language modes framework of Grosjean, in which it is thought that the level of activation of a language in a bilingual depends on the situation. So you have these two extremes on a continuum from monolingual to bilingual mode or unilingual mode. Unilingual mode would be the case in which a bilingual is speaking to a group of monolinguals, so only one of the languages is active, the other one is dormant or even inhibited. And the bilingual mode would be the opposite case, when a bilingual is speaking with a group of bilinguals, and so the two languages might be highly active, and they might be even code switching, or there's an interpreter who is working, and so obviously the two languages are highly active at the same time. So this would have an effect on language activation. Our question would be, would this impact phonetic behavior? And this is a graphical or visual or schema representation of the model. From unilingual mode, language B is not active at all. Language A is very active, and bilingual mode, the two languages are highly active. Would they be interacting more here? Now, most of the research on phonetic behavior in bilinguals does not take this into account, and the ones that do usually follow a different design that I will not be following today. They are studies that induce bilinguals into two different unilingual modes. So come to the lab, everything will be done in Spanish today. Come to the lab 2 months later, everything will be done in English today. Now, what I'll be interested in is comparing unilingual to bilingual modes. So come to the lab and do Spanish today, and come to the lab sometime later and do the two languages at the same time. Okay? And this is what I'll be showing. And so the questions is, does the same person behave differently in different tasks? No need for a control group here. And does the activation level of a language affect interlingual sound interactions? And we'll be looking at data from Catalan and a little bit from Spanish in a Catalan-Spanish contact. And the population, I was saying there's no control group. I don't think that this is quite a control group, but there are different groups of speakers. They're all bilingual in the same combination of languages, but different orders of acquisition and different levels of dominance. And the two variables that I'll be talking to you about today, one is the Catalan-specific vowel contrast between O and A, and the other one is the Catalan-specific stress reduction rule, according to which vowel A becomes in unstressed position in Catalan, but not in Spanish. Now let me begin with a study that is not about this for a second. Yes. I'll give you some context on what we know so far about O-A contrast by Catalan dominant and Spanish dominant bilinguals, and I'll show you some new data. So let me tell you a little bit about the system, the Catalan vowel system. First, Catalan has two mid-back vowels, O and A, and like in this contrast, this minimal pair, dona and dona, dana, dona, which is woman, give, dana, dona. And so this contrast actually is involved also in an alternation, and so it's neutralized in some positions, in unstressed positions, so that when you add a stress-bearing suffix to a root, A turns into O, and O stays O. For instance, you have gota, gotata, but dana, donata. Okay, so that the contrast is not morphologically robust or morphophonologically robust, whatever, so that A sometimes appears as O in some situations. And the contrast is not marked orthographically. And Spanish only has one mid-back vowel. And there are cognate connections between A, O, and Spanish O. So that Catalan gota corresponds to Spanish gota, O to O, but Catalan casa corresponds to Spanish cosa, so A to O as well. So this, and the fact that there are lexical connections and that affect these interactions, I think that this is a recipe for failure. You would expect that this will go wrong somewhere. And this is what I expect, and this is what we find. The first thing is when we don't find this effect. This is easy. This is an identification study from O to A, percentage of O responses by someone else. This is not my data. The blue line is the Catalan dominant group, and the red line is the Spanish dominant group. There are some differences in the identification of A, but actually what I want to point out here is that the two curves are sigmoidal. This is something like categorical perception. There's not much of a difference. But when you measure production, this is a read speech task. This is the Catalan dominant group, two clouds, the Spanish dominant group, completely merged. So they hear it well, they don't produce it well. What's going on? So maybe what's going on is this. Maybe they can pronounce or they can perceive Catalan A. So in some tasks they do, but they have not developed a robust category for A or something like this. Or maybe they have, but they have not developed robust lexical representations of the words that have this sound, so that they don't know which word has which vowel, and that is the problem. And if you give them read speech, of course they're not going to know, even though they might not have problems with these data. So I'll be looking a little bit at this, whether there's an effect of encoding or something like this, or short-term memory load. And these are the participants in this task. There's 30 Catalan-Spanish bilingual females, no males because there were only 7 or 8 who showed up. They are too cool to help. They don't come to the lab. And they were recruited all on the island of Mallorca. The 30 participants were divided into 3 groups. The Catalan dominant group, 10. The Spanish dominant group, another 10. And this first Spanish dominant group is close to balance, being balanced according to a questionnaire. And the other 10, they are more far or further from being balanced, more Spanish dominant. And so these are the results from a questionnaire. Basically, it's just a questionnaire. It's self-report, but we use it to classify the participants into groups. And the task is a 3 alternative forced choice odd one out task, in which all what we tested was the contrast between dones and dones. It's this. The stimuli were recorded by 3 Catalan male speakers, and in this task they hear 3 stimuli in a row in one trial, and they have to say which one is the different one. There's an interstimulus interval of 500 milliseconds, and it's not only the word, it's embedded in it's not only the vowel, as it's usually done, it's embedded in a word. So there are combinations like o-o-a, a-o-o, o-a-a, a-a-o. Okay, which one is the different one? That's easy if you can hear the difference, or you can keep it in mind for a while. And then there were cases in which everything was o-o-o or a-a-a. Now, the 3 stimuli in every trial had been recorded by a different speaker. Okay, so nothing was exactly the same. And these are the results. 2 months of work for 1 table, right? Like for all of us. The means, 92% correct for Catalan dominant speakers, 72 or 71% correct for the Spanish dominant speakers. But what matters here is that there's a lot of variation. Notice that some of the Spanish dominant speakers are getting it quite right. They're close to 89, 90%. So they really don't differ from the Catalan dominant speakers or participants here. But others do differ, 50, 60. So I think that what we learn from here is that Catalan dominant listeners encode the contrast, the OA contrast, optimally. They can do this task quite well. This is not difficult. They hear the difference. They can retain it in memory for a little bit. But Spanish dominant listeners do not, or well, some do and some do not. So that Spanish dominance does not necessarily lead to failure, but what happens is that Spanish dominance leads at least to individual or greater degree of individual variation. So comparing this to what we know from before, among Wall's data, perception or identification is optimal, but when a task needs a bit more memory load, then things start to go a little bit less well. Okay? Now, we have a better picture of what happens with this contrast. It's a difficult contrast, and we've been able to detect this. Let's go to the tasks that have to do with the bilingual modes. The production task, the first one that has to do with the OA contrast. The participants are the same participants that in the previous study, and this is what they do, or these are the materials. There are 7 Catalan words with O, 7 Catalan words with A, and then there are 14 Spanish words with Spanish O. Now, these 14 Spanish words, of them, 7 have a Catalan O cognate and 7 have a Catalan A cognate. Okay? That's why there are a lot more Spanish words than Catalan words. The words are embedded in meaningful sentences. They're short, but it's not only the word. And there's a lot of data. Actually, there's more Catalan data than Spanish data, so there's a mistake there. And the task is simple and boring, but it's illustrative when we compare it to what we knew from before from other studies. The task is just a listen and repeat task, a delayed shadowing task, which is commonly used in second language speech studies. What matters in this task is that speakers have an acoustic model, have something to follow, and this at least gives them a clue of which has which vowel. So if the problems were coming from there, everything should be solved here. They should be getting it quite well, and if it doesn't, then not exactly. The stimuli had been recorded by 3 Catalan-dominant males who recorded the Catalan materials and 3 Spanish-dominant males who recorded the Spanish materials. Then the recordings had been were cut and randomized and everything. And there were 2 sessions, as you know. The unilingual session, so that the participants shadowed the Catalan materials only. And 48 hours after that, at least, so 2 days later or a week later, they came back to the lab and they participated in the bilingual session in which they were shadowing the Catalan words and the Spanish words in one single block, randomized. And the question is, would there be more of an interaction here? Now, I don't think that we could say that our unilingual mode is really unilingual. They are bilingual. They know that I am bilingual. I was the one that was collecting the data. We are in a bilingual setting, the University of the Balearic Islands in Spain. I speak to them in Catalan in the first session, but they respond in the language that they want. So by the time that they start the experiment, they only use Catalan words, but it's not like Spanish is completely inactive, right? So I think that we could say that the unilingual mode is somewhere in between, while the bilingual mode is further away. It's more towards the bilingual side. These are the results. The group 1 is the Catalan dominant, group 2 is Spanish dominant, and group 3 is Spanish dominant, further away from being balanced, O and A, and this is F1 minus F0 in mel units. Here, what matters is that the contrast is quite robust for these speakers, for the control group, let's say. They're very different. The contrast is also robust for the Spanish dominant bilinguals, and it's also robust. There's no merger for the Spanish dominant bilinguals. So this is different from what we know from the other task, the red speech task. But notice 2 things. One is that there are no differences across groups regarding Catalan O, so Catalan O is not impacted, but Catalan A is impacted. Although they just heard a model, and actually they're hearing the same model, the A is more O-like for the more Spanish dominant you are, although there's no merger in this case. So what we've learned from here is that all speakers produce a difference between O and A, and this is different from my previous study. And so what I think is that the results of my previous study were due mostly to not having developed word knowledge, not knowing which word had which, and they were just reading. So maybe it was that, maybe not, but that's what I think. And here, while they all produce the contrast differs in size, so that we know that at least linguistic experience affects pronunciation of A, and once word knowledge is left out, there are still phonetic effects remaining in some way. There are differences across groups. So that Catalan A and Spanish O are linked, and Catalan A is attracted to Spanish O, or to Catalan O at least. It's brought up. One simple lesson, let's use different techniques to study production because it will give us different kinds of data, and we will be learning different things. And another lesson is that there are phonetic factors, and these are different from word knowledge or encoding factors. This is what matters most to what I wanted to talk to you about. This is the Catalan O data and the Catalan A data by all the participants. There was no interaction between session and any of the other factors. And this is session 1 and session 2, O and A. Notice that there is, let me show you with this, there is a difference between O and A in session 1, and there's a difference between O and A in session 2, the bilingual session. And these things are kept constant. But this is what matters. There's a little bit of an acoustic difference, so that Catalan A becomes a little bit more O-like, although still very far from Spanish O, but it moves in that direction a little bit. And it happens the same with Catalan O, so that Catalan O in the unilingual session is different from Spanish O in the bilingual session, while these two actually are not different. So it's pulled and merged. Pulled up and merged. Okay. The effects of session for both vowels and all three groups are as follows. The bilingual mode pulls Catalan O and A towards Spanish O a little bit, and the size of the Catalan O contrast remains stable across sessions. So that I think that one possible conclusion is that the presence of Spanish in the task affects the acoustics of Catalan, but does not affect the relationship between Catalan O and A, or however the contrast is represented. And that interlingual interactions between Spanish and Catalan are possibly modulated by the activation level of the two languages. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Study 3, basically the same idea with a different variable. This is the variable. The phonological pattern of unstressed vowel reduction, and sorry, this slide is quite patronizing, I'm sorry. This is for a different audience. So there's a phonological process of unstressed vowel reduction that leads to a categorical difference between stressed and unstressed vowels. So there's a phonological rule. Well, other languages don't have that phonological alternation, but still have stress effects. So that vowels in unstressed position differ from vowels in stressed position, but this difference is not categorical. This is what you get in Spanish, explica, explicación, or explica, explicación. The E is here and is here. It doesn't matter if you move the stress away, but the vowel in explain is not available in explanation. It's not explanation. Now, Catalan is an alternating language, like English, and Spanish is a non-alternating language, like Spanish. In this example, this is the Spanish vowel system, a 5-vowel system which remains constant in stressed and unstressed position, the same vowels. Now for Mallorca and Catalan, there are 8 vowels in stressed position, which reduce to 4 contrasting vowels in unstressed position. And what I want to point out is that there are 4 vowels, e, a, that reduce or neutralize to schwa, to a, such as in this case, casa becomes caseta. A turns into e. So that Spanish does not have an alternation between a and, so it's a, and Catalan has an alternation between a and a. And this is what I'll be focusing on this study, is there an alternation or not, or how much in their production. These are the materials. Oops, there's a mistake. Don't look at the consonant. This is unintended. So there are words with a combination with the vowel a, l, a, which in Catalan surfaces as ala, because the second one is unstressed, and in Spanish surfaces as ala. The second vowel is unstressed, but there's no change. So that we have vowels such as bala, pala, tala, sala, kiala, gala, mala, which are cognates in Spanish. It's the same words, same meaning, not a problem. Okay? The only difference, there's a bit of a difference in the L, but most of the difference comes from the schwa or non-schwa in the second syllable. The task is exactly the same sessions, repeating materials from the same talkers. And what I want to highlight here, we still have 3 groups. But now we have 3 conditions. So there are 2 sessions, it's true, but I've analyzed it in a way that there's condition 1, which is the Catalan materials in the unilingual session. Condition 2 is the Catalan materials in the bilingual session. And condition 3, the Spanish materials in the bilingual session. And this is condition 3 because since these are all cognates, what I'm taking is a within-word analysis. Same word appears here, then it appears here, then it appears here. Okay, and this is the kind of analysis that I'll assume. That's why I can take 3 levels for this analysis. Now the analysis is based on the Euclidean distance in F1 and F2 between the stressed and the unstressed vowel, before the L or after the L at 25 milliseconds further away or apart from the boundaries for the L. So that we would have a larger Euclidean distance for Catalan because it has an alternation than for Spanish because it doesn't. And these are the results. Now, this is group 1, this is group 2, and this is group 3, not group 1. Yeah. This is, sorry, condition 1, condition 2, condition 3, so Catalan, Catalan, Spanish. And this is the Euclidean distance, or the difference between the two vowels within the same word. Notice a few things. This is how much of a change there is between stressed and unstressed. In Catalan, in the unilingual session, there are differences that are due to dominance in Spanish. These are the same differences in the same Catalan materials, shadowing the same tokens or the same stimuli in a different session, the bilingual session. And these are the Spanish materials, so that there is more of a reduction for the Catalan dominance. These are not different from these, although they look to be. And these are different, so that highly or strongly Spanish dominant reduce a lot less than Catalan dominant, who reduce somewhat more in their Spanish. What I want to highlight is this: there's a difference between the way that they produce the Spanish materials and the way they produce the Catalan materials. So they either apply or not apply the rule, although it's not that simple, as you see. But again, what matters more to me is the difference between condition 1 and condition 2. So how much of a difference there is between the stressed and unstressed vowel in the same Catalan materials in the two sessions. And there is less of a difference, less change in the bilingual session, so that it looks more like Spanish, although it's not Spanish and it's very far away, and less like Catalan, so less vowel reduction in this case. Okay. Summary. There are effects of the session for all three groups, so that the bilingual mode reduces the acoustic difference between the Catalan vowels, the stressed and unstressed a. The monolingual mode enhances the difference between Catalan vowels. This is either one or the other. We don't know what's reduced or enhanced. Fact is that they are different. And also the difference between Catalan and Spanish patterns are the difference between how they behave in Catalan and how they behave in Spanish reduces in the bilingual mode, where the two languages become more like each other. Again, the presence of Spanish in the task seems to be affecting phonetic behavior or the acoustics of the Catalan words, and there are also differences across groups in unstressed vowel reduction that could be explained as a function of language dominance or the effect of Spanish. So wrapping up, the first production study that we looked at was a production study in which I measured the difference between Catalan O and A, or the contrast between O and A, by 30 Spanish-Catalan bilinguals differing in language dominance, and we found that dominance or experience impacts pronunciation. We knew that. We know it again with other data. So that in prior work of myself with the same contrast, I found that the reading data revealed that there was a merger of the contrast by Spanish dominant bilinguals. It turns out that there's not so much of a merger actually, or at least they can imitate partially this difference. It's not that they are clueless. And this seems obvious, but second language learners are not so prone to do this kind of task in this way. Even if they are imitating, they might still get a merger. And this has been shown for other communities and other contrasts. But also, even when the contrast is maintained, the phonetic detail is affected, and so that the dominance of the Spanish dominance of the speakers is revealed by the location of A, which is closer to O if they are more Spanish dominant. Regarding the two sessions or the effects of language mode, it was found that both that Spanish or the presence of Spanish words impacted the sounds of Catalan in some way, so that both Catalan O and A were pulled by Spanish O or attracted to it, or it seemed to. And also that unstressed vowel reduction was inhibited in the bilingual mode. There was reduction, but less so than you would find when Spanish is not present in the task. So in my opinion, the patterns of performance or processing interference modulate interlingual interactions between Spanish and Catalan, or there is a role for them. They should be accounted for, and this is different from what we've been seeing so far. So let me just show you colors. It's a very simple, it's not even a model, it's just a picture. So these are notes for a bilingual. Notes could be word notes, could be category notes, it could be some sort of other type of independent knowledge that a bilingual has of one of the languages, and there are links between these nodes, say that they are words. And then there are other nodes for the other language, and there are links for these other between these other nodes. But a bilingual has two systems, and there are connections between the nodes of the two systems. And some of these connections are quite strong because they're not only similarities in phonology, morphology, they're also semantic equivalences. This would be the case of cognates, for instance. So the nodes are very close. And in some situations, one of the languages might be highly active and the other one might not, or might be inhibited. Or in other situations, one of the languages is active, the other one is inhibited. But in some situations, both languages could be highly active. And looking only at phonetic data and thinking only about that, what I'll be claiming, or what I see the data suggest, is that when this happens, the nodes move closer together. They become more like each other. If this happens frequently, this is my proposal or my view, if this happens a lot, these nodes or these links are more likely to become stronger. And so these differences or the links to become more difficult to be broken or separated or impacted. Okay. Conclusion. Interlingual sound interactions are not independent from lexical interactions. Lexical connections affect acoustics. I have not shown this. This is previous research, but this is something that I keep in mind, that I have in mind. What I think we have shown, or the data shows, is that interlingual sound interactions are affected during processing by the circumstance, by the situation. How we account for this, it's still, I really have no idea. So one possibility would be that lexical activation impacts acoustics. Maybe if the words of the two languages are active, that will affect the acoustics. Maybe if the sounds of the two languages, so maybe what happened is that you have produced sounds in the two languages. We could be able to tease this apart if, say, we have a study in which one of the languages is only read and not pronounced, and the other one is pronounced, say, and so lexical activation but not sound activation in the two languages would possibly be able to tease these things apart. What is active and what is bothering, or what is affecting acoustics or phonetics? And one way to see this would be that recently experienced episodes impact acoustics, so I'm not advocating for an episode or experience-based model, but I think that there's some role for that. And what I will conclude with this: interlingual phonetic interactions occur during processing, maybe lexical processing, why not? And so simplifying, the takeaway message is that one thing would be to train him to perceive and produce the new sound, the contrast between th and sa, which he seems to have a problem with. Then he would have to associate them with words, and this is a different process, a different problem, and this wouldn't need to be done separately or differently, and then make sure that his boss doesn't come back into the room, because his German will go back up and he will have more problems with his English than he already has. Okay. Thank you.